Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. I'm delighted to introduce this shared session with Determine, and our topic today is contract management. It's time to think about the user, and we're going to be talking a lot about this whole development of self-service contract lifecycle management. So let's just quickly have a look at our agenda. We're going to have a couple of minutes on introductions, and then I will be leading off with a quick point of view based upon some IACCM research relevant to this topic, and then we'll be handing over to our friends at Determine just to talk about what self-service contract lifecycle management can and should look like, together with some examples, some real-world scenarios before we get to our Q&A. So let me introduce quickly who it is that we're going to be speaking with today. The key players here: Matthew Markham, Vice President of Client Solutions at Determine, and Konstantin Lembarakis, who's their Vice President of Product Marketing. So Matt, Konstantin, welcome. And as you can see, extensive experience from both Matt and Konstantin in terms of this whole area of contract lifecycle management. And I think, if we may, you've probably had a chance already to glance at their resumes as you signed up for this particular webinar. So maybe we can move on and start the journey on this message. So let me, as I said, perhaps kick this off with some of the findings we've had. Absolutely at IACCM, two key points I think to make here. One, as it relates specifically to contract management software, our research and our benchmark reports have clearly shown that there's been significant investment by many companies in bringing in some form of contract lifecycle management solution, but that the adoption rates are often quite low. And one of the major reasons for that appears to be because too many times it's really been introduced thinking only really about the needs of central staff, and if it isn't user-friendly, of course, it isn't likely to get much use. So that's sort of certainly true from the software point of view, but I think this goes further. It goes to the whole question of what really is the purpose of today's contract, legal, procurement groups, and increasingly I think there is an understanding that their role has got to shift from being one of review and approval to being one of enabling the business and empowering the business. And of course the only way we're going to do that is through a conscious shift in our own behaviors, but also in the nature of the technology we deploy. So let's go to some of our statistics, and one of the most important points, I suppose, is that one I've just been making, that as the quote says here, in an age of fast-growing complexity, the winners are those who simplify the lives of others. And if we think about that, of course, in our own context as consumers of goods and services, that would absolutely be true. We're all of us looking for things that actually make our lives simpler, for people who make our lives simpler. And that, I think, is a really important message to central support functions, because it does imply a very real change in our success criteria. So how are we doing when it comes to the world of contracting? Well, we asked a range of questions that went to users of contracting services rather than our immediate membership. Obviously, this statistic would not be surprising at all if it went to our membership, because you would expect them to say that contracts are pretty important. But the point is that the business generally does recognize, of course, we all know winning a contract is a time of celebration. Managing the business, building proper business controls, risk management through the use of contracts is widely accepted. So as you can see, a full 98% agreed that this stuff is important. There was a little bit of variability. Certainly if you go to some cultures, of course, there isn't necessarily that same level of acceptance. But nonetheless, overwhelming, yes, contracts matter. So what else do we discover? Well, so then we asked people to what extent do they personally find contracts important. And there we begin to get a bit of a slippage. Now, of course, that slippage may be because they happen to be in a place in the business where their visibility and actual day-to-day utilization of contracts is very low. But we also discovered that quite a few people just didn't actually see them as that relevant to the way they did things, even if they were in a function or an area of the business that should be putting those contracts to use. So let's move on again and start to look at some of the underlying factors. So we're now looking at how we can better understand what is the user experience today. And as you can see, one of our questions we went through with a series of statements, in fact, and asked people to tell us whether they agreed, strongly agreed, somewhat agreed, didn't agree, and strongly disagreed. So first of all, contracts contain important information that's directly relevant to how I do my job. Well, 72% do agree with that or strongly agree with that, which one would hope they would. But as you can see, there was a contrast in opinions, and we just tried to take a few of the statements that were made by some of the survey respondents as illustrations. So, you know, with one of them we got the standard old, it's the relationship that matters, probably as a good contracts never come out the draw school. And at the other end of the scale, we had an account executive from an IT outsourcing company that took a completely different view. The data from our contracts feeds into just about every system in the business. It's critical to the way we perform, the margins we achieve, and the satisfaction of my customer. So quite a contrast of attitudes there, and I would say probably the second one is a lot healthier as an attitude. We'll see later whether Matt and Constantine agree with that view. So what else did people tell us? Well, contracts are easy to access. I'm confident I can find the current and complete version. Now, all of us would hope that that would be 100%, I'm sure, but it isn't. As you can see, only about half of those responding agreed or strongly agreed with that particular statement. Sometimes it's difficult to find anything. Recently, I had to ask a supplier for their copy of our agreement. Embarrassing. Certainly would be embarrassing for an in-house counsel. I suspect many of us have found ourselves in that situation where we can't find the document, or we're not confident that the document we've got is actually the most recent version. But then we had a construction project manager, construction industry, obviously one where contracts are absolutely paramount importance, change management is regular, frequent, and so you better have good records, and in this particular instance, clearly, there has been investment to ensure that there is a central repository, and that, interestingly, and I think this is an important area, I'll be interested to see what Matt and Constantine say on this, is of course the extent to which change can happen within the system, so there is one consolidated record, and we're not having to remember to upload stuff or bring in stuff from outside the system. All right, what else did our users tell us about their experience? Well, contracts are easy to understand. No, they're not. Only 12% agreed or strongly agreed with that particular statement. Are they? Who for? Well, at the other end of the scale, and unfortunately with only 12%, there weren't that many positive comments around. There was an HR manager in an outsourcing company who said, we have an obligation management system which has allowed me to focus on what I need to know and do. I used to worry all the time about what I was missing. So here was a good example of where the contracts organization has really looked to try and work to facilitate better understanding, to disseminate the information that people need to do their job properly, and isn't relying upon perhaps traditional forms of contract that quite clearly are written in ways and structured in ways and delivered in ways that are often very, very difficult to understand or to find the right information. You've got to remember, in an area like outsourcing particularly, many of these agreements are several hundred pages long. So to just throw those over to untrained staff and expect them to know what to do with them is, of course, putting the business at very real risk. So what else did we understand? Well, when I need help or guidance in understanding or interpreting the implications of a contract, I know where to access the information or the help that I need. And again, only 43% agreed or strongly agreed, or 57% didn't. That's not too good. It's not a great commentary on the job that some of us are doing right now in terms of facilitating the business. Really difficult to find the right person, and when you do, they're always busy. Operations manager, financial services. We probably know about that. We certainly are all very busy, and the challenge then very often is, of course, we don't necessarily have well-structured help desks or support systems. And you know, here we see a contrast in that second statement, a series of on-demand apps. So we need to start thinking much more laterally about the nature of the technology that can be deployed that really facilitates people to get stuff when they need it, where they need it, when they need it. And all our evidence suggests that, of course, the easier we make things, the higher the levels of compliance and the better the quality of our contracts and the higher the satisfaction of our customers and our suppliers. So we have some really interesting data on some of that. I won't go into it right now, but there is plenty to suggest that this is really an important area. And again, I suspect Matt and Constantine will give us some clues and insights into how we can actually empower the business through that technology. And I'm satisfied with the contracting process and the way it supports my personal performance. Well, people are not. Only 1 in 6 agree or strongly agree that the process works well for them. I think many of us would sympathize with that. Many of us as practitioners would say, today the contracting process is not coherent enough. There isn't sufficient integrity within it in terms of its ownership, in terms of the overall integration of that process. Many of us would share that view, that frustration, and indeed would very much welcome greater support from management in making sure that we could actually handle this in a more robust way. So as one operations manager commented, I'm not sure there is a process. It seems really inconsistent and frustrating. Yet at the other end of the scale, a comment from an aerospace business development director who obviously is benefiting from automation. Contracting no longer feels like mountain climbing. I rather like that particular statement. So, Matt, Constantine, are you going to help us to stop climbing mountains?
Tim, we're definitely going to try to help you do that. So thank you so much for having us and hosting us on your group here on the webinar. And Matt and I definitely will look forward to sharing our respective thoughts here from the Determine point of view, so to speak, on this topic of self-service. So before I do that, I also kind of want to just do a quick intro again for those of you that may be familiar, or those of you that may not be familiar with Determine. You know, as a global company, we are focused in the areas of contract management, source to pay. We have organizationally, we have thousands of users that are using our products every day. And we're really looking at managing the challenges of how companies are trying to best take advantage of what technology can do. And definitely one of these areas is the ability to help improve and help administer contract management in a new and more effective way. And as you can see from our experiences here as we came together over the past couple of years as a company that we are today in Determine, we have deep experience in the areas of contract management, and through our heritage and history, we are definitely seeing these trends that are taking place and taking the shape of what contract management really is today and what it requires from users. Before I do that, though, and get into the self-service concept, one of the things that we continually seen and has been a topic and theme that we've talked about for several years now is this evolution of this enterprise CLM. I know that IACCM has been a really big proponent of this concept because what it is that we talk about the expansion of contract management beyond the areas of silos. And as you look here in kind of this wave format that we talk about, we see that taking an enterprise view of contracts is really providing better visibility for getting total access. It's an ability to get better control and compliance of your contracts. It's helping you get value maximization of the contracts you have in place, and then also being able to manage risk and improve collaboration. And we feel really that as part of this an enterprise CLM approach and taking a look that contracts are not just for specific users and specific business functions, that the self-service component of that really fits well into this because it helps provide all of these things to a wider group of the organization and makes contracts much more accessible and easily integrated into existing processes and workflows that are needed to really manage contracts. So as part of that, one of the things that, again, we're seeing is that, again, CLM, contract lifecycle management, has traditionally been managed by the business function. In our experience, we've often seen that procurement or sales or HR has led the initiative, and oftentimes we've found that legal or the general counsel has been caught in the middle trying to do the refereeing and making sure contracts are up to date and up to snuff, so to speak, with the current legal conditions and requirements of managing the risk within an organization. We've also seen that this approach has solved immediate challenges, but sometimes found that it leaves the organizations at a disadvantage. And so what I mean by that is that the access to contract information for those that are in the wider organization are still disjointed. They might be frustrated, some of the points that Tim brought up about not being able to find what they're looking for or not even being clear on what they need or how they need to go about the process for executing their specific requirements is something we continue to hear and is something that needs to be a challenge that's solved. We also see that legal often misses opportunities to help harmonize processes because they don't have the right tools or technology in place to help them oversee and manage that. And in the end, we find that the enterprise needs a better way to align the wider business needs and users for those who are just really, in some cases, more occasional users and have an occasional access and don't need to be in the system, the CLM system, all the time. So with that, what we're seeing then is that what's driving our customers, our stakeholders to act is the things that I have mentioned up above, which are the traditional use cases for where organizations are going to CLM for. We didn't scrutinize contract compliance. Now we're in trouble. We lost a vital contract with a key customer because we weren't aware of conditions. We're spending $2 million yearly in a contract management personnel, and my budget's about to get cut, so I need, something's going to give. So these are traditional reasons, but then, as I mentioned before, the expansion of this enterprise approach to contract management is really now also CLM for the masses, if you will. I'm just an occasional user of the CLM tool, but I'm trying to access simple contract forms and templates, and it's almost impossible. And it very much resonated with, again, with what Tim mentioned before from the research that IACCM presented. So with that, what is it that we're getting at? If we take a step back into the idea of the bigger play here of technology in general, what we're seeing is an overwhelmingly increasing trend of having the organization or having users be able to have a self-service format. All of us in some form or the other have experienced this. For instance, the top example I have there, where we go to an airport, we go to the kiosk there, and we know that we can print our boarding pass or get information about how we can onboard or how we can get our luggage so that we can facilitate in getting to the terminal on time. We also experience this often at the gas station, at the petrol station, where we just simply want to pump our gas. These are experiences that 10, 15 years ago none of us would have thought of, and we'd always have to wait for somebody to help facilitate and be in the intermediary to get what we needed. And then finally, we're seeing this in the transportation, where, for instance, a new company in Indianapolis called Blue Indy is actually facilitating the ability to rent electric cars online, and when you arrive at your destination in Indianapolis, you simply go into your car and use the car when you need it. And these are innovations that are happening in the consumer world, but we're seeing this then also now translating into business technology, and some of the things that we are experiencing and developing on our own platform. So the idea, going back to what we talked about before, self-service for the business user, we know the traditional users of contract management are folks like the procurement director, the sales director that need the contracts to help manage their business function. We know that IT is involved because they need to make sure that they know the governance process of what's being done with the contracts. Are they in the cloud? Are they not? What's the security? How does the process work with our existing systems? Those requirements need to be enabled and secured for IT to move forward. And then finally, the general counsel, as we've seen it, taking a much bigger and active role in being involved with how contract management is actually being deployed as a solution and how they're being involved with trying to have a bigger impact on the business and working with procurement, sales, and many of the other business user functions, including HR, that has to be involved with CLM. But this then takes us to the idea of what about the other users? What about the 90% of folks that need to access CLM at some point in time or have a requirement that needs to be met? And so what we find in our experience at Determine is that we've often seen a variety of different types of contracts that are out there. So examples of such include confidentiality agreements, purchasing type of agreements, revenue, commercial real estate, channel side agreements with partnerships, personnel agreements, including areas of staffing for HR, and even to the extent of areas like physicians agreements where organizations, particularly in healthcare, have to track how physicians are being logged in within the hospital environment and keeping track of what contracts they have. And then having the wider experience of corporate general agreements, M&A, and the expansion now is what we're seeing is now I want the option of not only having these types of agreements in place, but also being able to build my own, having the ability to configure a process that entails a very specific set of users or user cases that may meet a majority of the requirements that we're seeing, and using a scenario that Matt will talk about is saying SAM the self-service, and we'll talk about that a little bit. If we're looking at this then purely from a technology framework, from our standpoint and what we've seen, what really is needed to enable and further the requirements of self-service from a CLM standpoint, whether you're already using a CLM technology or you're looking to evaluate contract lifecycle management and understand what do I need to be able to truly enable, maybe thousands of users who are asking for CLM and being able to do core functions. We're finding that the four core areas really are around mobility and having the ability to have the contract management system be displayed and provide some type of capability on a mobile device, whether that's a phone to approve a contract or review a contract or request a contract, or even an iPad to be able to do some authoring. We're finding that as a result of that, templates are also a key component. So having blueprints that are already designed for very specific use cases and meeting the needs of the quote-unquote masses, as I've mentioned before, is another core element to enabling self-service within an organization. Finally, e-signatures is another very important piece, and probably one of the most important that we've experienced, simply because of getting to the execution stage, particularly if you're dealing with third-party contracts and having contracts go back and forth, being able to easily execute the contract and know the review process and doing this from the mobile device, as I mentioned earlier, is something that has really accelerated the ability for end users to get into a system and have the hands-on that they need when they need it, but not get deeply involved into the processes that they may not need to have access to. And then finally, what is the key enabler for all of this is really the workflow. Having the ability to manage the complexities of the workflow for the very specific use cases that you're trying to design that will provide the enablement for those self-service users when they need it and how they need it is essential. And that's really kind of the crux of how self-service has evolved and how we've been able then now to deliver these types of capabilities to our clients and be able to have the self-service when they need it and how they need it. So the do-it-yourself mentality is something we very much promoted. And as part of, again, the spirit here of what we're doing in the spirit of the election season here, the idea here is that vote for self-service contract management in 2016. It's something that we're seeing as a very compelling use case for why CLM should be deployed and implemented in your organization, as well as for furthering the future and being in line with the developments of technology into the next several years as we see them happening and unfolding in CLM and in wider frameworks of technology that we work with and providers that we integrate with. So with that, what I'd like to do now is introduce my colleague Matt, who will actually take us into some very specific use cases, if you will, for where we've seen self-service be a part of how you can integrate into the organization. Who are these types of users, and how may self-service type users be different from others in the past of where you might have them already aligned on a contract lifecycle management system. So Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you, and how about you try to enlighten us here a little bit with some real use cases.
Thanks, Constantine. I appreciate it. So the first thing we want to do is take a look at the different people involved in the self-service process here. And so in the traditional use cases, we have that RIC requester user. This is the one you see most often out there in the industry, which is you have a person that just needs to make a request for a contract. They don't know much about contracts. They're just immediately going to fill out a little bit of information and then hand it off to someone else who's going to take over from there. And at that point, they just become an observer of the process until it's literally over with. Contrasting that with the PADI power user contract administrator, this is sort of the other extreme of that. This is the high-end user that understands the whole contracting process and is the traditional user of a contract lifecycle management solution where they can do everything and do all of it. But what we're needing is something that's in between, right? We don't need to have these power users for everything that we do, but we need to have users that have more power than that requester user who can't really do much. And so really that's what we're defining on the bottom there with the SAM self-service empowered user. So this is a person that can go beyond just the request and put things in the system. This is a person who can walk through the contracting process with a large degree of autonomy. So who is this SAM self-service? So clearly they're an employee of the company drafting the contract, but they're generally not going to be a lawyer, and they're generally not going to be a member of the legal team. However, that said, they are definitely a savvy contracts person. So a use case you might see in this would be they're a salesperson who understands the contracting process for, let's say, software license agreements because they do them all the time. This is a person who's seen these contracts time and time again. They might be a high-volume kind of contract business, and so they're more than just the requester, right? They get it. They know how to do some of this stuff. So let's take a look then at what a process might look like for that kind of a user. So across the top here, this is just an example, a screenshot, if you will, from our piece of software that's showing just a workflow. And if you notice, we'll zoom in on the next slide here. But the basic idea here is that everything needs to be driven through a workflow process that guides the user, whether they're a requester or whether they're a heavy-duty contract manager or whether they're the SAM self-service person. Workflow is really one of the keys that drives us through the process, leading the user towards that end goal of getting a contract out the door. And so, as Constantine mentioned, those sort of four pillars, right? We have the workflow, the templates, the mobility, and the e-signatures. All of those things grouped together is what makes this thing work. And in particular, I always like to focus on the workflow aspect of it, because the workflow really is where this thing happens here. So across the top, what you're seeing there is just zoomed in from that previous screen showing the workflow, in this case of a contract request, to move it through the system. All right, Constantine. All right, so if we take a look at the self-service process here, we're going to look at kind of the in-depth sort of, maybe you'd call it the worst case scenario of the self-service user where kind of everything happens all at once. So we're going to start off with that user. Go ahead, Constantine. He needs to create a self-service contract. And so Sam, our user, go ahead, Constantine, is just saying, hey, I need a contract. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to create my own. So when Sam creates that contract request, he'll walk through and fill out all the information necessary to get the thing out the door. But when he reaches the end of the request process, he's now got an opportunity to go ahead and say, I'm going to create this myself with a self-service process. So as part of that, he's going to be presented with a series of options here. Most importantly, he needs to choose what is the template or the basis for creating this contract document that we need to get out the door. And so to that end, Sam is going to choose the contract type with the eligible self-service templates. So because this is a system being used by everybody, the legal folks and the non-legal folks alike, we're going to designate some of those templates as being self-service templates, where he can choose from those list of self-service templates that work for that particular contract type. Once he's chosen a template, he now needs to specify a whole series of template options. There might be more or less depending on the kind of contract he's working on. But let's talk through what some of those options might be. So of course, unsurprisingly, right, templates include a list of clauses, including things like the primary and fallback clauses. Some of those clauses are going to be automatically chosen for the template based on the metadata of the contract record. For example, a governing law clause might be chosen automatically based on where the location of the customer is going to be if it's a sales contract. Some of the clauses then will be just part of the template. They'll be on there whether we ask for them to be there or not. And some of those clauses will not be part of the template but can be added. So the user is going to have the ability then to say, well, you know, I know this clause is part of the standard template. I don't really need it. It's not applicable. And the second piece there would be, right, this is a clause that I probably am going to need, or I think the customer might ask me about this, so we'll go ahead and add it in there. Now, in addition to that, because we're giving the user the ability to choose some of the clauses that are included in there, we also need to give that user the ability to decide and make some changes to those clauses for ones that are marked as editable. In talking with my customer, I understand that they're not going to like the language of this clause. I just know they're not, so I'm going to allow them to make some changes to the text of the clause even before we generate the actual documents here. Try and get some of that redlining out of the process before we give it to the customer. And again, we're doing all this outside the legal group, right? This is that empowered user that doesn't have to always work forward and work with legal here. All right, so continuing on that self-service process, though, in that editing process, the user may actually go, you know what? I'm a little bit out of my element here. I need to get a little bit of help. I want some advice from the legal folks. So I'm going to ask them to get involved. So we're still going on the self-service path, but we're going to have Sam ask for some legal help, and that's going to add the legal team to the project. So before this, they haven't been involved at all, but the legal team is going to get added to the project to help out here. They're going to look at some of the edits that Sam has potentially made. They're going to suggest some alternatives. They might add some clauses or take some clauses out. But legal also might get involved in another way. So while we're keeping track of what Sam has been doing here, which clauses he's adding, which ones he's taking and editing out, we're actually keeping call it a score, if you will, of the overall document that is yet to be generated. And what we're looking at here is if the score reaches a certain point, so many changes have been added, we've added weird sets of clauses, whatever those conditions may be that we define, we may actually not wait for Sam to ask for help. We may actually go ahead and add legal onto the project, regardless of whether or not Sam wants them there. So we're going to try and help Sam the best we can to get through this process with a minimum amount of legal help. And so in this case here, whether or not Sam has asked for help or whether or not the system has chosen it for him, the legal users are going to go in and make changes to those template clauses and, of course, make alterations to the metadata of the contract as well. All right, so ultimately that's going to lead us to generate the contract documents that we're going to be using as the basis for working with our customers here. And so when we get through that whole process of the legal help and we get through the whole choosing the clauses, that's going to, Sam is going to go ahead and say, yep, I am ready to go to generate the document. He'll generate that document and move it forward. So up until this point, it's just been minor involvement of the legal folks. We haven't been looking at overall approval of contracts yet. We've just been trying to get to the point where we can generate the document. So next up then is to look at if we need to have approvals, those approvals will still occur, and those will be based on the rules that we built into the system on things like contract value, all of those kinds of typical approval rules that would happen. And assuming those approval rules go well, the self-service user, you're just pointing out that the self-service user is not outside the approvals, right? They're still generating approvals that have to occur before we move on to this thing. And so those will occur whether or not it's a self-service or not. And once those approvals occur, if necessary, then we're going to move on to the next step of this, which is the e-signature process. So again, keeping that in mind, trying to enable this whole thing to keep the legal folks out of it where possible. The e-signature process is going to grab hold here and facilitate the thing actually getting signed and being delivered back to the system, taking full advantage of what those systems offer for their workflows and notifications. Okay. When that occurs, this will be our first opportunity to send this off to the counterparty for them to actually review the document. So we're trying to discourage them from doing redlining. We're going to hand it off there, and when the counterparty receives it for e-signature, of course they can say, I'm not signing this. This isn't right. So SAM then would have the option of canceling that e-signature, and when that occurs, that's going to be rolled back to I'll call it a collaborate stage. And in that collaborate stage, this is where, if we can't move it all the way through the process with SAM, the self-service user, this is where legal would really take control and own the process with that traditional redlining back and forth with the client. So in that case, SAM becomes an observer now, but he managed to move this thing a large way through the process all on his own, getting this thing done with a minimum of the legal team being involved. All right. So where is this kind of self-service concept having an impact? Well, certainly we've seen it. The scenario number 3 is probably the one we see most common, and that's a simple NDA, right? Many companies have an NDA. Let's say it's a two-way NDA. It's not really negotiated that much, or we're choosing not to negotiate it that much. That's really easy to do in this process, right? The document doesn't get negotiated. The clauses are pretty standard. We don't have to, even in our self-service process there's not a whole lot of choosing the right template, picking the right clauses. The template pretty much is that with the clauses in there. So we see that one as a common place that companies going down this self-service path like to start with. Scenario number 2 and scenario number 1 are probably the second most common ones we're seeing there. Procurement being a really common one, where there's a high volume of contracts, and the contracts are relatively standard with a few minor changes. The procurement process kinds of contracts work well for this because we have users in the procurement process that understand procurement contracts, that understand the kinds of fallbacks that they need to make or clauses that they need to include based on the scenarios and conditions that we see. And so that's really what the example we just saw there with SAM, that's really what that one's probably most modeled after, is a procurement kind of contract. But it works equally as well for a sales contract where the conditions are well known and the contracts aren't necessarily highly negotiated, or there's a large volume of them. But there's plenty of others where you could see this thing work. Physicians agreements working with hospitals would be an example, maybe high volume employment agreements or contractors, all the kinds of things where the contract content is pretty well known by the people that actually are redoing the requesting, and the legal team can get involved only when necessary to move the thing forward. All right, I think I have covered everything I wanted to cover on that particular one.
So thank you, Matt, for the introduction and this idea of the self-service. I think what we wanted to, really do here now is just kind of open up this dialogue and as a question, because there are definitely, quite a bit of topics that we've covered here. I know that Tim has covered the topics, again, from the standpoint of the research that IACCM has presented in terms of understanding where users are frustrated with contracts and understanding what they need to do to get to their level to be maybe even more highly motivated and interested. What we've done is talk a little bit about some of these realities of how the technology comes into play and how we can actually make these things enabled so that organizations can better use and better leverage a CLM. And these specific use cases are, again, as a reiteration of that, really the true areas where we're finding self-service coming into play within the organizations that are using our technology. So at this point, I think what we want to do then is just kind of leave this open for any type of Q&A and see if anybody on the outside has any questions about what we presented, and see if we can provide some further enlightenment for those that are interested in knowing more about how they can do self-service as part of contract management in their organizations.
Indeed, we have quite a number of questions, some interesting ones. If we can start off perhaps with this one from Paul. In my view, contract lifecycle management systems deployment has to be part of a wider cultural change initiative in improving people, process, and systems. Do you share that view?
Absolutely. From our standpoint, we find that it's really the culture that needs to take this on. Oftentimes what we've found is that where contract management has failed, is that it'd be kind of taken as an approach that may not have looked at the wider needs of the organization. And part of what I had shared earlier on the slide with the enterprise CLM, this enterprise concept, is really one of the reasons why we feel so strongly about the ability to make sure that the wider organization is involved with the deployment of a contract management system, simply because even if they're just focusing on say a procurement deployment or a deployment within sales, everybody that is a stakeholder that could or would be involved within contract management at some point would be on board with the concept and deploying. In fact, we've got several clients where typically we've found where legal has often led the charge and has become the main stakeholder that then brings in the other organizations, and procurement in our experience has been often the one that has kind of led the deployment and then leading into further use cases of sales and other types of requirements specific, that might be more industry specific. But again, Matt, I don't know if you have some experience there from what we've seen from a cultural perspective and where we've seen success and failure.
No, I totally agree with you, Constantine. That's probably the one thing, if there's a mistake I see people make, it's that they'll try and implement a contract management system, just the legal team, and they'll implement it and then get other people involved, or the sales group is going to implement it and then get legal involved. It really has to be a larger, wider look at the organization, because if you're trying to get people to adopt the system, you actually have to have everybody involved that are stakeholders or primarily also end users of the system, so that you design something that can actually be implemented and used. If you don't do that, it almost always fails.
Yeah, I think if I may just add to that, I suppose we often see a tendency to try and just automate what's already there, when the problem often is that what's already there is no longer really adequate to meet the needs of the business. So simply doing the wrong things a bit faster doesn't really help anybody very much. While it's important for users to know what the supplier is obliged to deliver, users end up interpreting the contract in as many different ways, thereby weakening the contract and a company's relationship with the supplier. How have companies dealt with this challenge? So essentially, I guess, raising the point that, well, many of the users don't really make the correct interpretation of contracts. Can automation help them with that?
Matt, why don't you take this one first?
Well, I don't know that there's anything that can, help you interpret a contract better from an automation point of view. There are some tools out there that can help with that. The critical thing to making it work is having the legal team involved in trying to standardize the contracts as much as possible. So, the less variation you have in the contract, certainly the better understood they will be. And so to that, and that's the whole concept of automating the contracts, is going to hopefully reduce the amount of red lines, which is going to reduce the amount of variations and interpretations of the clauses that are in there in the first place.
Well, if I may add to that, I think one of the big trends certainly that we're seeing is growing understanding that contracts themselves, not just the contracting process, but the actual contracts, need to be designed for the user community. The European task force, one or two of those listening have probably heard me say this before, but a European task force looking at this as part of the European Commission made the observation that contracts today are designed by lawyers for lawyers in the expectation of litigation, and that is a source of risk. Their point being, if contracts are going to be usable instruments, if they contain rights, rules, obligations, activities that need to be undertaken by the business, then for heaven's sake, we should write them in a way that people can understand them. And I think, to the comment that was made about their understandability, it isn't just the user community that gets it wrong. We've been doing quite a lot of experiments and various workshops on this, and to be honest, most lawyers can't understand the work of and writing of other lawyers. They frequently have to go back to the original source to say, what did you actually mean? So we really do need to have a dramatic rethink, and I'm pleased to say that a number of, particularly the more enlightened legal departments, are absolutely leading that. We've just, in fact, finished a conversation with one today that wants fundamental reform so that the contracts they write can actually be put to use and understood in the business. Writing gobbledygook shouldn't be an issue of pride. So few companies are well advanced on the enterprise contract lifecycle management journey. Even some of the basics, such as document management, are not in place. What is the best place, or where is the best place to start, and how?
You know, I think that's a great question, Tim, and it's really difficult without having a deeper understanding of, you know, the particular person who's asking the question, their background. You know, from our experience, it really depends on their, you know, their viewpoint of what the organization has done in the past. Have there been any failures in looking at it in the past, and what do they currently have in place? So, you know, there might be, in some cases, limitations to what they have if they've only got a contract management system, say, for instance, that is focused, say, in procurement, where a lot of the functionality will be really geared towards integrating source to contract and contract to pay. Now, in those cases, obviously you're trying to maximize the usage of contract management within procurement in particular, and really trying to align transactions with contracts. In many cases we find that, particularly with services organizations, you know, it's very, very important how you align, say, invoices with contracts when you're not dealing with purchase orders. So these types of things are, you know, critical to say, are we going to be successful with our procurement contract deployment? But if you take a step back and you look at the big picture, and you're still in the kind of the earlier stages, and you really don't have a CLM technology in place, or maybe it's only being used as a repository, you have to take a very deep look at what your goals and ambitions are, and how are you able then to say, can we make this an enterprise initiative so that in 5 years from now we know that we have a common platform, we know that CLM is being deployed across the organization, and that we're able to meet the respective requirements of a wider user base, not just, say, procurement, and we're able to do that with a common workflow, a common set of master data, and a common set of processes that you know, would align the enterprise. And again, that's why it's a very difficult question to answer depending upon what you may already have, but if you're looking at it and you're trying to start out, you know, these are some of the recommendations that we would provide in terms of how you should take a next step.
Yeah, Constantine, let me add into that a little bit. One of the things, particularly when you're looking at contract management from an enterprise standpoint, is, you know, where do you start? One mistake I've seen made more than once is to assume you need to solve all of your contract problems in the first go-around. And I would tell you that's a terrible decision. What we've learned from watching our customers do this and helping customers through this is that you need to, as an organization, agree on what's the most valuable contract type to start with, because you're going to learn several things in doing that. Number one, you're going to automate something that's high value to you. You're getting all of the users and stakeholders involved in it, but a big part of implementing a contract management system is understanding your own workflow process as a company internally, and that just focusing on one or maybe two contract types initially will help you understand how your business works to help fit it into what the software actually does. If you try and boil the ocean, as we say, good luck. It's going to be a really long, difficult journey, and you may never succeed.
Yes, good advice. Are there any controls on the templates a user can have access to?
Yeah, that's a huge part of contract management, is controlling who has access to the templates. So a good system would put in place controls around you know, divisions within the company, roles within the system, groups that the user belongs to within the system. All of those things would be typically organized together to determine whether a user has access to a template or not. Having users have access to, you know, all the templates in the system is in general just considered a bad plan. And so, yeah, definitely controls over that for sure.
So, concern about SAM here. Enabling SAM to select pre-approved clauses is one thing, but enabling SAM to make material changes to the contract form itself without approval is very high risk.
And that's a big reason why there's approval in the process, as we mentioned there. And there's also mentioned that whole concept of scoring the contract record, if you will, before we generate the documents. Two things happening there. One is approval of the overall terms of the contract at the end once the document has been generated. So before the customer ever sees it, they're going to have an approval process that may involve lots of people, finance, CEO, CFO, who knows. But certainly before we even get to that far, we want to make sure we haven't upset legal by making material changes to the contract that are sort of out of bounds. And so to do that, you're looking at a scoring technique based on predictive text analytics of what's actually in there. So that's going to, that's a little bit of a science there to figure out what's the right amount of predictive text you need, how much a clause has been changed from its original version to make decisions as to whether or not you want to allow them to move forward without some help.
And indeed, somebody seems to like that. In this self-service scheme, they say the legal pre-authorized templates and alternate clauses would have already been prepared and uploaded. The legal involvement is here, just done ahead of time. I like the idea of a scoring system on the number of changes. Well, that was it, actually. It was just a comment. So sounds like they like what you've done there. I'm sorry, I'm just scrolling through to see what else we've got. Can we add comments from several stakeholders and keep until we discuss and approve a draft version?
Yeah, the answer to that is, of course, yes. So any good system would allow you to add comments along the way either within the documents themselves after they've been generated or before they've been generated as part of the overall contract record. And those comments might be in the forms of public comments regarding things that are going on in there, or they might even be directed at specific users. In fact, they may be private between a couple of users on the system so that you can make sure the process is well documented and commented on before you actually get the thing out the door, for sure.
Do you make any distinction between the management of different phases of a contract?
Yeah, we actually have a whole concept of personas within the system. The idea there is there's roles of people, things like a legal user and a requester and a self-service user. But every contract record has what I like to call pseudo roles. And that would be things like who is the actual requester of this. They're the person who started the process off. And you have a concept, and they have particular rights that they have within the system. You would have the business owner of the contract once it actually goes into force. They also have particular ownership and responsibilities and permissions within the system. And then, of course, you have the legal team, and then other roles we can create that become stakeholders in the process, all of which have different rights at different levels of the system.
I like that. It's interesting. Certainly our view of best practice process design, the processes we recommend are very much based around an analysis of personas, not job roles, but personas, in the sense that, of course, the job role could be fulfilled by different people, particularly depending upon the complexity or the risk associated with it. You'll have different levels of authorities, different levels of skills, etc. So utilizing personas rather than trying to specify job roles is a much more powerful way to do the design. Self-service is great for generating the agreement, but how do we then share the content across the teams, asks Claire.
So the content is shared via the management system itself. So we mentioned those personas of people who have ownership stakes or important stakes within the contract itself. All of those people have access to the information throughout that whole process. So we're not hiding it from anybody in there. They all can look at the information that's been presented. They may not be able to edit it. They may only be able to be observers through the process. And then, of course, they'll all have the ability to see the documents once they've been generated, but before they've actually been sent off to the counterparty.
Now here's a great question, and I hope you're going to answer this by saying it's down to the personas. In many instances, business points rather than legal points are being negotiated. How do we use a CLM system to empower the business unit to distinguish the two and make those business decisions?
Yeah, a big part of that is organizing the data in a logical way. So one of the ways we organize the data is by presenting it on a series of screens as we're putting the contract together. And so some of those screens are related to the the contract sort of details that we need to hammer out, and some of those screens might be related towards the business things that we need to work out. And the business rules that ultimately drive the approvals can be a combination of either straight business kinds of approval rules or contract kind of approval rules, or a mix of the two. But yeah, it's the way you organize the data that ultimately helps drive the users down the right path.
Presumably, though, against particular principles or clauses, you can identify sort of internal ownership points, can you?
Of course, yes.
So, obviously if this was a payment term, for example, you may well point them at finance rather than at legal.
Yep.
What about the post-execution phase? How is self-service deployed for obligations to be followed up upon after the contract has been probably signed, if I can get to the hidden word? Indeed it is, after the contract has been signed.
Yeah, obligations management is an emerging field, and it has to do with lots of different things. If we look at it from a sourcing point of view, let's say we're putting together a sourcing contract, one of the things we would typically want to look at would be spend against a contract, for example. And so that's really dependent on the system that the contract management is hooked to. If we're, in our case, we have a source-to-pay platform, so we actually have the sourcing data and the procurement data in the system itself, or it can be fed to the system from external systems like SAP, where it's easy to manage the obligations against the contracts. If you're looking at a sales contract, then of course you have other things that may be involved in there as well, and other systems that may involve. So really the key there from an obligations management point of view is having your system be flexible enough that you can integrate it to those other systems that ultimately own the data that helps enforce the obligations.
So I'm very conscious we're up to time, and we still have a few questions here. We'll take one last one, I think, if we may, and then, if you don't mind, Matt, Constantine, we'll have to ask if you can perhaps go back to the people whose questions we don't manage to get to. There's been so much advocacy for contract simplification and automation, which is quite understandable, given the corporate perception of contracts more as a stumbling block than a support service. My concern is, how do we guarantee contract quality assurance and retention of critical terms in the frenzy to make the contract simple? May I just tackle that for a moment? I really do think we need to tackle what do we mean by simple. Far too often I think the resistance of the legal and contracts organization to really look at simplification means that for the rest of the business, simplification is mistaken for brevity. Making it a short contract does not necessarily make it simple. In fact, it quite often does the reverse. Making it a clear contract certainly does make it simpler. And I think people are awakening to the point that today's contracts do not have quality because they're not easy to understand, and that, of course, induces many of the subsequent errors, the aversion, the failure to use them, interpret them correctly. There are many, many areas and aspects of quality control that we should be focused on, but probably the foremost one is actually to make our contracts things that people can understand. Now, I think we had some examples of people using apps and other methods, the obligation management systems that were just being mentioned, where the interpretation is made easy, but also just in the way that contracts are structured, the use of graphics, for example, to help people find the clauses that are relevant to them. Traditional contract structures, there is absolutely no reason why they have to be structured the way they are. It's just because that's the habit that lawyers have. But the lawyers are usually not using the contracts. It's actually the business that uses it. So there's a lot of very radical thinking going on in this area, and it's not extreme or risky. It's quite the opposite. It just is really challenging and saying we live in an increasingly user-centered world, a user-centric world. Contracts can't continue to live in their own little world where they're divorced from that reality of simpler methods of utilization. So Matt and Constantine, thanks so much for what I think has been an excellent webinar. A lot of very positive comments coming in from the audience. They found this very helpful, very clear, so I hope that's a universal view. Certainly, I think this is an incredibly important topic, and it's one where, as my comments have indicated, I think we all have to work in partnership to really think about how we improve the ability of users to make effective use of contracts, and as a result of that, of course, to get better business results, including better management of risk. So thank you very much for spending this time with us today, and thank you to our audience also for spending your time with us.
Thanks, Tim.
Bye for now.